You think you understand power, but you're making the same mistakes that have destroyed kingdoms, ended careers, and ruined lives for centuries. Machiavelli didn't write The Prince to teach cruelty. He wrote it to reveal the harsh realities that most people refuse to acknowledge about how power actually works in the real world. And there are 6 specific traits that he identified as absolutely fatal to anyone who wants to maintain influence, respect, and control over their own destiny. These aren't moral failings in some abstract sense. They're strategic disasters that will systematically undermine everything you're trying to build. The first trait that will destroy your power is excessive mercy without discernment. You think being kind to everyone makes you a good person, but Machiavelli understood that indiscriminate kindness is actually a form of weakness that invites exploitation. When you're merciful to those who would harm you, when you forgive without requiring change, when you give second chances to people who have already shown you their true nature, you're not being virtuous, you're being naive. True power requires the wisdom to know when mercy serves justice and when it enables injustice. The person who cannot say no, who cannot set boundaries, who cannot distinguish between those who deserve their generosity and those who would abuse it, will find themselves surrounded by parasites and predators who mistake their kindness for weakness. Machiavelli knew that a leader who is only capable of mercy will be taken advantage of by those who have no such limitations. And this dynamic doesn't just apply to political leadership, it applies to every relationship, every workplace, every situation where power dynamics exist. You must learn to be selectively merciful, strategically kind, and wisely generous, or you will discover that your good intentions have paved the road to your own downfall. The second fatal trait is the inability to inspire fear when necessary. This doesn't mean ruling through terror or being cruel for its own sake. It means understanding that respect without any element of healthy fear is merely politeness, and politeness disappears the moment it becomes inconvenient for others to maintain it. When people know they can disrespect you, dismiss you, or betray you without any meaningful consequences, they will do exactly that. Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both, not because fear is inherently superior to love, but because fear is more reliable than affection when people's interests conflict with their emotions. You need people to understand that crossing you comes with a cost, that taking advantage of your generosity has limits, that your patience has boundaries. This isn't about becoming a tyrant. It's about developing the kind of presence that makes people think twice before they decide to test your resolve. When you're only capable of being liked, you become dependent on others' approval for your sense of security, and that dependency will be exploited by anyone who recognizes it. True power comes from being loved by choice, not because people think they can manipulate your need for affection. The third trait that destroys power is procrastination disguised as deliberation. You tell yourself you're being thoughtful, careful, strategic, but really you're being paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong decision. Machiavelli understood that in a world where circumstances change rapidly, the ability to act decisively is often more important than the ability to act perfectly. While you're weighing every possible outcome, calculating every potential risk, seeking consensus from people who will never have to live with the consequences of the decision, your opportunities are disappearing and your competitors are moving ahead. Indecision is a decision. It's the decision to let circumstances control you rather than taking control of circumstances. The person who waits for perfect information will wait forever, because perfect information doesn't exist in a complex world. You must learn to act on sufficient information rather than complete information, to trust your judgment rather than seeking everyone else's approval, to accept responsibility for outcomes rather than trying to distribute risk so widely that no one can be held accountable. Power flows to those who are willing to make decisions when decisions need to be made, not to those who can generate the most sophisticated analysis of why every option is potentially problematic. Your ability to think clearly under pressure, to choose a direction when multiple paths are possible, to commit fully to a course of action once you've chosen it. These are the skills that separate leaders from followers, influencers from spectators, people who shape their reality from people who merely react to whatever happens to them. The fourth fatal trait is the compulsive need to be understood and liked by everyone. This is perhaps the most seductive trap for people who have good intentions but don't understand the dynamics of power. You want to explain yourself, justify your decisions, make sure everyone sees your good motives, get consensus before you act. But Machiavelli knew that the need for universal approval is incompatible with effective leadership. because effective decisions often require disappointing some people in order to serve the greater good. When you need everyone to like you, you become incapable of making the hard choices that leadership requires. You start avoiding necessary confrontations, postponing difficult decisions, and compromising your standards to maintain harmony. But this harmony is an illusion. It's built on your willingness to sacrifice your own judgment to avoid conflict, and it will collapse the moment a real crisis requires someone to make unpopular but necessary decisions. People don't respect leaders who are more concerned with being liked than with being effective. They may enjoy the comfort of knowing they can influence you through emotional manipulation, but they won't trust you with anything important because they know you'll sacrifice principles for popularity. True respect comes from being someone who can be counted on to do what's right even when it's not popular, even when it costs you something, even when it means standing alone if necessary. The fifth trait that will ruin your power is the inability to recognize and respond to betrayal. You want to believe the best about people. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You interpret their actions in the most charitable way possible. But Machiavelli understood that naivety about human nature is a luxury that people with power cannot afford. When someone shows you through their actions that they cannot be trusted, when they demonstrate that they will prioritize their own interests over their commitments to you, when they reveal that they're willing to undermine you for their own gain, you must accept this information and act on it, rather than hoping they'll change or making excuses for their behavior. The person who continues to trust after trust has been violated is not being noble. They're being self-destructive. You must learn to distinguish between people who make mistakes and people who make choices, between those who fail occasionally and those who fail you systematically. Betrayal is rarely dramatic or obvious. It's usually subtle, gradual, and rationalized by the betrayer as being justified by circumstances. You must develop the ability to recognize patterns of disloyalty before they become patterns of sabotage. This doesn't mean becoming paranoid or suspicious of everyone, but it does mean accepting that not everyone who claims to support you actually does, and not everyone who appears to be on your side will remain there when their interests conflict with yours. The sixth and most destructive trait is the confusion of weakness with virtue. You've been taught that humility means diminishing yourself, that strength means helping others even at the cost of your own well-being, that power is inherently corrupting and should be avoided. But Machiavelli understood that power is neutral. It's neither good nor evil. It's simply the ability to influence outcomes and protect what matters to you. When good people refuse to develop and use power effectively, they create a vacuum that will be filled by people who have no such hesitations about pursuing their own interests. Your reluctance to be powerful doesn't make you moral. It makes you ineffective. Your inability to advocate for yourself doesn't make you humble. It makes you invisible. Your refusal to fight for what you believe in doesn't make you peaceful. It makes you complicit in allowing those beliefs to be trampled by people who are more committed to their agenda than you are to yours. True virtue requires power to be implemented effectively. Compassion without strength is mere sentiment. Justice without the ability to enforce it is mere wishful thinking. Love without boundaries is mere enabling. You cannot protect what you care about, advance what you believe in, or create positive change in the world if you're unwilling to develop the skills and acquire the influence necessary to make things happen. Machiavelli's lessons aren't about becoming cruel or manipulative. They're about becoming effective in a world where effectiveness determines outcomes. These 6 traits, indiscriminate mercy, inability to inspire healthy fear, paralysis through overanalysis, compulsive need for approval, blindness to betrayal, and confusion of weakness with virtue, are not just character flaws. They're strategic vulnerabilities that will systematically undermine your ability to protect yourself, advance your interests, and create the changes you want to see in the world. You must learn to be strategically kind rather than universally nice, to command respect rather than just seeking affection, to act decisively rather than deliberating endlessly, to prioritize effectiveness over popularity, to trust wisely rather than blindly, and to embrace your power rather than apologizing for it. The world needs people who can combine good intentions with effective action, moral principles with strategic thinking, compassionate hearts with strong spines. But it starts with recognizing that power is not something to be avoided or apologized for. It's something to be developed, refined, and used in service of what matters most to you. Machiavelli's warnings are not about becoming someone you don't want to be. They're about becoming someone capable of protecting and advancing what you do want to be. But let's examine how these 6 fatal traits manifest in your actual life, because understanding them intellectually is useless if you can't recognize them in your own behavior patterns. Right now, today, you're probably making decisions based on these weaknesses without even realizing it. You're probably sabotaging your own influence while telling yourself you're being a good person. You're probably letting people walk all over you while convincing yourself that your tolerance makes you superior to those who set boundaries. Think about your current relationships, personal and professional. How many people in your life take more than they give? How many consistently fail to follow through on their commitments to you? How many seem to have emergencies that become your problems, needs that become your obligations, priorities that somehow always supersede your own? If you're being honest, you'll recognize that you've trained these people to treat you this way through your inability to say no, your fear of disappointing them, your compulsive need to be seen as generous and understanding. You've made yourself so available, so accommodating, so willing to sacrifice your own needs that you've become a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected. This isn't noble self-sacrifice. It's strategic suicide disguised as virtue. Machiavelli would tell you that you've created these dynamics through your own choices, and you can change them through different choices, but only if you're willing to accept that being respected is more important than being liked by people who don't actually care about your well-being. Consider how you handle conflict in your daily life. When someone disrespects you, what do? When someone violates a boundary you've set, how do you respond? When someone takes credit for your work, undermines your authority, or spreads rumors about you, what action do you take? If you're like most people, you probably rationalize their behavior, make excuses for them, or convince yourself that taking action would make you just as bad as they are. But this is exactly what Machiavelli warned against: the paralysis that comes from confusing moral purity with effective action. Every time you fail to respond appropriately to mistreatment, you're teaching the person who mistreated you that this behavior is acceptable. You're also teaching everyone who witnesses this interaction that you can be disrespected without consequences. Your reputation for being pushover doesn't just affect your relationship with the person who tested you. It affects how everyone else perceives and treats you. People talk, and they share information about who can be manipulated and who cannot. Your failure to defend yourself becomes public knowledge, whether you realize it or not. The person who allows themselves to be disrespected in small ways will find themselves being disrespected in increasingly larger ways because they've established a pattern that others learn to exploit. Now let's examine your decision-making process. How long do you typically take to make important decisions? How many people do you consult before you feel comfortable moving forward? How often do you change your mind based on new opinions rather than new information? How frequently do you miss opportunities because you were still thinking about it when someone else took action? Machiavelli understood that indecision is often more damaging than making the wrong decision, because indecision prevents you from learning, adapting, and moving forward. When you make a decision and it doesn't work out perfectly, you gain information about what doesn't work and you can adjust your approach. But when you refuse to make decisions, you gain nothing except the illusion that you've avoided risk. The truth is that not deciding is the riskiest choice of all, because it guarantees that you'll remain stuck in whatever situation you're trying to change. Your perfectionism isn't protecting you from mistakes, it's protecting you from progress. Your desire to have all the information before you act isn't making you smarter, it's making you irrelevant. While you're gathering data and seeking consensus, the world is moving forward without you. The opportunities you're being so careful about are being seized by people who understand that good enough is better than perfect, and fast is better than flawless. Think about the people in your life who you consider successful, influential, or powerful. Do they make perfect decisions? Do they have complete information before they act? Do they get everyone's approval before they move forward? Or do they have the confidence to trust their judgment, the courage to act on incomplete information, and the resilience to handle whatever consequences result from their choices? The difference between them and you isn't that they're smarter or more talented. It's that they're willing to make decisions and live with the results while you're trying to find a way to make decisions without taking responsibility for outcomes. Your need for approval is perhaps the most subtle and destructive of these weaknesses because it disguises itself as social consciousness or emotional intelligence. You tell yourself you're considering others' feelings, being collaborative, maintaining harmony, but really you're being controlled by your fear of disapproval. You're making choices based on what will generate the least resistance rather than what will produce the best results. You're prioritizing other people's comfort over your own integrity. This creates a fundamental problem. When your decisions are primarily motivated by avoiding disapproval, you become predictable to anyone who wants to manipulate you. They know exactly which buttons to push to get you to do what they want. They know that if they express disappointment, hurt feelings, or disapproval, you'll change your position to accommodate them. You become a puppet being manipulated by anyone who understands your psychological triggers. People who are primarily motivated by approval-seeking cannot be trusted with important responsibilities because their loyalties shift based on who is applying pressure in the moment. They cannot maintain consistent positions because they're constantly adjusting their stance based on the emotional climate around them. They cannot make tough decisions because they're more concerned with avoiding conflict than with achieving objectives. This makes them unreliable allies and ineffective leaders, regardless of their good intentions. The inability to recognize betrayal often stems from your desperate desire to believe that everyone shares your values and operates according to your moral code. You assume that because you wouldn't lie, manipulate, or betray someone, others wouldn't either. But this assumption is not just naive, it's dangerous. It prevents you from seeing red flags, recognizing patterns of disloyalty, and protecting yourself from people who view your trust as weakness, to be exploited, rather than a gift to be honored. Betrayal rarely announces itself dramatically. It usually begins with small violations of trust, minor compromises of loyalty, seemingly insignificant failures to support you when support was needed. The person who will eventually betray you in big ways almost always starts by betraying you in small ways that you overlook, excuse, or rationalize. They test your boundaries gradually, increasing the magnitude of their violations as they learn that you won't hold them accountable. By the time the betrayal becomes obvious even to you, they've already established a pattern of putting their interests ahead of their commitments to you. Your confusion of weakness with virtue is perhaps the most tragic of these 6 traits, because it prevents you from developing the very qualities you need to make a positive difference in the world. You've been conditioned to believe that power corrupts, that strength is dangerous, that influence should be avoided. But consider this. Every positive change in human history has required someone to accumulate and exercise power on behalf of that change. Every injustice that has been corrected, every right that has been secured, every improvement in human conditions has happened because someone was willing to fight for it using every tool at their disposal. When you refuse to develop power, you're not staying pure, you're staying irrelevant. When you avoid influence, you're not remaining humble, you're remaining ineffective. When you decline to advocate for yourself and your values, you're not being virtuous. You're being complicit in allowing those values to be undermined by people who have no such hesitations about pursuing their agenda. The world doesn't need more powerless good people. It needs more good people who are willing to become powerful enough to make their goodness matter. Machiavelli's insights weren't intended to create monsters. They were intended to help decent people become effective in a world where effectiveness determines outcomes. These 6 traits will destroy your power, not because they're morally wrong, but because they're strategically disastrous in a reality where other people are competing for resources, influence, and control. You can choose to remain above the fray, but the fray will continue with or without you, and your absence from it doesn't make you noble. It makes you irrelevant to the outcomes that affect everything you care about. The choice is yours. Remain pure and powerless, or become effective enough to make your principles matter in the real world.